So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Cranston Knight. Dr. Knight, you can take it away.
Okay, and I actually have things up and finally, okay, let me get things here. Okay. Okay. Okay, I can see you, Ben. I can see the Zoom. Okay, here's my thing. So how do I get to Zoom?
Go back to click the camera at the bottom, that one. There you go. That's it. Okay.
Click here. Okay, do you see me, Ben?
Yes, we see you. You want to just share your PowerPoint right now?
Yeah.
Screen?
You can see me.
Carlos, does Knight have co-host functions again?
How do I? Is this it? No. Okay, so let's Zoom. Okay. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so here we are. All righty. Hi, so today's lecture, my name is Dr. Cranston Knight. So first of all, I want to make sure that everyone can see me. And also that the audio is okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can see and hear you, Dr.
All
Knight.
right, great. Today's lecture, my name is Dr. Cranston Knight. I am an adjunct professor of history at St. Augustine College and also the historian at the Haitian American Museum here in Chicago. My area of interest is the Atlantic world, as well as decolonialization movements across the world and the impact that those movements had and reshaping the world. And I'm also a military historian. So that's a little bit about myself. The issue that I'm going to discuss today is the 1811 Slave Revolt, which is considered to be the largest slave revolt in US history. What makes it unique is not only the number of people who were part of this particular rebellion, but the fact that it was multinational and multi-ethnic. And as far as I know, if we're talking about the United States, there has never been a slave rebellion that brought in so many components. So it's going to be all those components that I'm going to try to intersect such that we have a clear vision of this particular rebellion. I named it Freedom or Death, precisely because that's the term that's going to be used by the rebels as they're going to march from one sector of Louisiana, from one plantation of Louisiana to New Orleans. The first thing I want to give you is some background, and that's going to be from a YouTube video, and that gives you an overview of the rebellion itself. Okay. Hey, Duress, I have a problem with showing the video. Oh, here it is.
The United States, like many other nations, has a tainted past. For decades, African people and their descendants were enslaved and abused by their captors. American history in regards to this period is a very sensitive subject. The atrocities committed against enslaved people are widely known, but certain events are left out of the history books. The German Coast Uprising is a largely forgotten event in US history. Even the name, the German Coast, has been forgotten outside of pockets of Louisiana, but the event was in fact America's largest slave revolt. Hundreds of people rose up against their tormentors and marched in pursuit of freedom. Their story, their effort, is one that all Americans should remember. I hope that this video will shed some light on this story of people who gave everything for a chance at freedom. The revolt occurred in 1811 along the Mississippi River, right after the harvest season had ended. During this time of the year, there was minimal work to be done, and the enslaved had a brief respite from their duties. By all accounts, the revolt was led by Charles DeLong, an enslaved man that sowed the seed of rebellion among plantations in the area. Charles's plan was to organize slaves and march to New Orleans, where he would demand freedom and set up a free colony. The uprising began at the Andrew plantation, near to where Charles was enslaved. The group attacked the plantation owner, Manuel Andrew, and his son, Gilbert, at night with knives and axes. Manuel was severely wounded and managed to escape. However, his son was killed in the attack. When I said demand freedom, what I meant was they were going to take their freedom at any cost. The troop began to grab what weapons and valuables they could carry before they began their march to New Orleans. Accounts say that 15 of the enslaved people left the plantation that night. From there, they headed to the DeLon plantation next door, where Charles was enslaved. Their troop grew larger. 8 people left from there. Each plantation that they passed increased their numbers, and with it, their determination. Witness accounts say that their march was reminiscent of a structured army. There were people on horseback, drums playing, and they marched in file. Along the way, they set fire to field and plantation houses. Only one additional person was killed, and there's a reason for this. Some slaves warned their masters that there was an uprising coming. Most of the slave owners in the area fled to New Orleans, where they took refuge in the city. Manuel Andrew, the slave owner that escaped the initial attack, retreated to New Orleans and gathered a militia with forces from the city. They set out to squash the rebellion, and squash it they did. After only a few days of marching, the group led by Charles encountered the militia in a short-lived but extremely violent battle. Many of the marchers were brutally slaughtered, but some managed to flee into nearby swamps. This next piece is graphic and to me explains why the event is not widely talked about today, but I think it's very important for everyone to hear it. The militia tracked and caught as many of the people who fled as they could find. These people, along with people who did not fall in battle, were executed, and the militia butchered their corpses and displayed their heads on spikes to strike fear into enslaved people. Over 60 miles of distance was dotted with human remains. Charles was given especially terrible treatment for being the leader. They shot him multiple times, dismembered him, set him on fire, and then decapitated him. All told, 95 people were murdered in their pursuit of freedom. Our history does not remember these people. It's as if we have a collective amnesia. Like the trauma of what happened is too much to handle for our nation.
Joyce, I want to go back.
I think we should honor these men in this room like we would anyone who fought for freedom and made the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you for listening.
Remember here.
Go back here. Stop share.
Okay. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can, Dr. Knight. We can.
Okay, good, good. I just wanted to make sure. So I want to get to my slides, so I get back. Okay, let me just share this again. Share, let me take this out. Yeah, this was an extremely important rebellion, primarily because it had some very specific aims. Unlike many rebellions which are going to take place in the United States, I have become recently aware that there was another rebellion which did follow some of the aspects of both the French and the Haitian Revolution. But this particular rebellion, because it was so large, was quite unique in that the individual who carries it out, Charles DeLong, really believed in the French Revolution, but also the Haitian Revolution. what the French Revolution brought to the New World.
Dr. Knight, can you pause for a second? Someone wants us to put it in slideshow mode. They're having trouble seeing the PowerPoint exactly.
Okay.
So full screen.
Okay. Full screen. Duress, how can I get full screen? Full screen? Okay, just a second here.
Screen on what?
Huh?
This?
Yeah, they can't see this.
You can't see it?
No.
I'm not sharing the screen.
Okay. Stop sharing or sharing.
No, just leave it alone.
Okay. Can you see it now?
No, they want it in slideshow mode, so it's like full screen. So you're not seeing the image like just shrunken down here.
Okay, so it's shrunken down. So, okie dokie. Congress will share it.
What does that say down there?
Try the F5 key.
What did that say?
F5?
Yeah, that should. Yeah.
Alrighty. All right. Good show. Okay. Can you see now? Everyone is okay with seeing, viewing?
I
Okay.
can see. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. The whole issue of nationalism.
Present buttons on top right corner,
Pardon?
top right hand corner.
Hit the share.
Present, like it's right next to share.
Okay. Can you see it now? Loading.
Perfect. We're
All
good.
right. All right. Perfecto. Okay. What is important about the French Revolution is it actually creates the first real sense of nationalism, that you are no longer simply an individual under, or for that matter, you were not simply an individual who was under the crown or under a monarchy for the first time. You belong to an actual state. So that everything that's done is done in the name of the state. And that changed foreign policy, world policy, and how people begin to view themselves from that point onward. So it's the French Revolution ends the monarchy, creates the whole concept of the nation state, and as we can see from the wars which will take place after Napoleon comes to power, he speaks of a united France. In essence, everything has a geographical boundary. Up until that time in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1830, there was no such thing as a nation state. In essence, we didn't know where one state started and another state stopped. After that particular treaty, 1830, and particularly after the French Revolution, one is very clear about where France starts, where Spain starts, where Prussia starts. You know exactly where it's at. It simply isn't a civilization anymore. It's now the nation state, and it is the highest form of political body. So I get to the next slide. Just a moment. The Haitian Revolution becomes extremely important because it's going to be those concepts of nation state that will be dispensed, that whole concept of what is the nation, what rights do individuals have, what are the rights of men. They become extremely important in terms of what people want. So yes, we want freedom, but what does freedom entail? And freedom entails creating your own state. So that revolution becomes extremely important in terms of the Atlantic world because it does become the first free state by slaves. From the United States, from an American's point of view, Haiti becomes not only a place where slaves have rebelled, where individuals have lost their livelihoods, I mean the French. It becomes also an existential threat to the United States proper itself, and it becomes a threat to slaves within the United States border. Can they recreate what is taking place in Haiti and the United States? The fear of slave rebellions increases exponentially. The slave rebellion in Haiti ends all forms of servitude, but it also becomes as I said, an existential threat, and the Europeans do not want to represent a slave society or former slave society and enter into a great nation or great power that is equal to France, Spain, or the Dutch. I think I just moved this along. So what were the rights of men? The rights of men are born free and equal in their rights, and those rights are liberty, property, security, and the end of oppression. The fundamental source of all sovereignty is the state, and the law is the exception. It is the general will. We have the right to make laws, and that was something new. Slaves up to that time, or certainly slaves in general, don't have a right to create laws. First time these free people have a right to make laws, and this is not lost on people within the Caribbean itself, and most certainly not lost by those individuals who are in Louisiana, which at that particular time were French-speaking individuals. So what makes it so multi-ethnic is the fact that in the very beginning, you have the Germans who arrive, who create the German coast, and that included part of the Mississippi and New Orleans. They created the first of 4 major plantations, but the individuals who were there are Native Americans, as well as indentured servants. Once the French occupied that particular large area, they bring in large numbers of slaves. And those slaves arrive around the 1700 and will continue from that point on. So you get a slave society that's coming in, and you have a slave society which is built by the French. Eventually, once the French leave, the Spanish will enter for a short period of time. They will continue it. The French come back, and that slave society, which becomes very multi-ethnic in terms of language. So you have individuals there who spoke Spanish, individuals who speak French, individuals who were just coming from various parts of Africa who were speaking various languages. You have Maroons who've run away from the French and now live in various parts of unoccupied territory, and they create their own language. So you have this very multi-leveled group of people in terms of linguistics. You also have individuals there who have been ranked according to skin color. So you have your Creoles. The French had 4 to 5 different definitions in terms of skin color, in terms of how people were divided, and people lived within that particular society. So within the United States itself, or it's not active in French territory, you had these 5 or 6 classes of individuals, both free and slave, in that particular area. I should do that one. So let's move to this. Once the revolution takes place, lots of individuals who had held slaves escape. Some go to Cuba, which is held by the French. They're rejected, and they leave there and come to New Orleans. Individuals who had held slaves in Haiti become refugees. They too also come to Louisiana. Once they are there, they recreate the society from which they came from. Why was Haiti important? Because it produced 80 to 90% of all the sugar used in Europe. It's extremely profitable. When they come to the United States, they restart the sugar plantation industry. Hard work, people are working sometimes 12 to 18 hours a day. Cutting sugar cane is extremely difficult work, but very profitable. The difference between American slavery and French slavery, the French were particularly interested in how much money they could make. They were not necessarily interested, as the Americans were, in terms of creating a slave society that would perpetuate itself. They simply wanted manpower. So they're bringing in as many slaves as possible to do as much work as possible so that they could gain as much money as needed that could be sent back to France or that would enrich themselves. The revolt in itself is quite interesting. There had been a number of revolts before. There have been revolts under the earlier French. There have been revolts once the Spanish take the area for a short, very, very short period of time. There have been revolts shortly after the French retake the area before the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. There have been revolts by the Germans who were there along with the Spanish. There had been revolts by the Maroons, so it had a history of revolts to begin with. That made it quite unique because that wasn't taking place in other parts of what would become the United States. The individual who starts the rebellion, it was named Charles DeLong. DeLong himself is a very interesting individual because they're not quite sure if he was born in the United States or he was born in Haiti. They do know that his mom was Haitian. As far as I'm concerned, that made him Haitian. There are lots of Haitian slaves there because as those individuals are leaving Haiti, they bring their slaves with them. Those individuals who had escaped to Cuba, they're bringing their slaves from Cuba to the United States. You already had slaves who were already in the United States under the French. So you've got individuals coming from different parts of the Caribbean area bringing slaves. And that made for a very interesting integration of individuals from these various areas where the language is different slightly because some individuals who had gone to Cuba had learned some Spanish. There are individuals who had been in the United States for a period of time. They spoke Spanish. You had the individuals, once again, coming from the other areas, that they speak French. And you had the Maroons who were there and they probably spoke some type of Geechee African language combined with French and perhaps a little Spanish. That made for a very interesting group of people. Charles DeLong, who will be the rebel leader, this individual was actually a slave driver. He whipped the slaves, he kept the slaves in line. He held a high status as far as the French colonials were concerned. It's this individual, along with individuals on other plantations, who will lead this revolt. What was once again different about the American slavery versus the French, after you had the sugar cane had been harvested, you had a short period of reprieve. And that gave people time to talk to one another. And so there was a plot, and the plot is that a very individuals or his lieutenants talked about change. And what they want is a Black republic. They want a place that's very, very similar to Haiti. They want a republic. They want government minus monarchy. They want a government minus slaves. They want a government that was responsible for the people, and all those great words that we hear in the American Constitution. Most certainly that's part of the French Constitution once the French Revolution ends. Question has been asked and often posed, were those in the French Revolution against slavery? They spoke about it, but did they end it? No, they did not. But they did speak about ending slavery and the horrors of slavery. So that's there. The rights of men, what rights do individuals have? There are individuals who are in New Orleans, who are French, who are discussing this issue. The fact that this revolution has been carried out in the name of the people. And it's heard by all of the slave population in one form, shape, or fashion. When the revolution ends, or sorry, when this revolt ends, actual pamphlets of the rights of men are found in the bunk areas and the cabins where the slaves dwelled. So it's definitely something that these individuals were aware of, something they definitely talked about. They discussed the whole issue of nationhood, creating their own state. Most rebellions in the United States had uprisings, but they didn't seek to create their own state. This becomes quite unique because these individuals want their own land, their own government. When they decide to make the revolt, There are individuals who are just coming in to the port city who are coming from various parts of Africa. Although the United States had ended the movement of slaves from Africa to the United States, there still were ships that were coming in. And these individuals who were getting off the ship, there is some historians believe that they had military training. They are speaking a very different language. They're not quite sure what the linguistical paradigm that was set up such that they could understand one another. One thing is for sure, they were able to develop a language that's going to be used by those regardless of what language is spoken, and they're going to be able to develop a language whereby they have a common cause, and that common cause is to create a new state period within the French territory. Their military aim was to move from plantation to plantation, as you can see in the slide, along the Eastern Mississippi River or in the parishes, and create a slave army. At the same time, they were calling for an uprising in New Orleans itself, and there were many free blacks. So it was a two-pronged attack. In military history, this is the norm. So you would find it in the occupied areas during the Second World War. You find it in the First World War. You find it in many areas which have been held where you have communication between a rebel army and individuals who are in the capital city itself. This is a very new concept in terms of individuals actually being able to communicate and say, we're going to lead a rebellion. We're going to march our troops to a particular point, and at the same time, you simultaneously have an uprising, and the two will meet and then take over New Orleans. So it's a whole new concept in terms of military aims. It had only taken place once, and then it's people, and that was in Haiti itself. The second time you see it is in the United States. So you can see the influence in terms of Haitian military strategy being played out in the United States itself. The number of slaves, which also makes it unique, people think there may have been anywhere between 200 and 500 individuals who joined this particular rebellion. And these are some of the issues which I had already addressed in terms of the multinational linguistic armed forces, that there were people from Ghana and Angola. You had the Maroons, and you had Spanish-speaking free slaves, and that the rights of men, this whole concept, political concept, which was new to the world, has been assimilated by the slaves themselves. They're accepting this whole issue of the fact that individuals have rights. It's not an issue that's being discussed among the slaves in the United States. It is most certainly an issue being discussed by slaves who were very aware and that participated in the Haitian Revolution. This simply shows the route that the rebellion is going to take. It shows where it starts and the particular plantation where it starts. There's a second plantation that's going to be taken, and then these individuals are on their way to New Orleans. The major problem, one, they've marched in a military formation, so it's very easy for them to have been seen, and they were. The fact that the first individual that they tried to kill survives. He then brings together about 80 militia and also the American military, because after 1803, that territory is seceded to the American government. And so the American military wasn't very far. You had two groups, the militia, the American US military, and they're caught in the middle. There was no place for them to go. So the failure of the rebellion, one, overwhelming firepower. Second, that they had been exposed by other individuals who had spoke about the fact that this rebellion was, and it was not only going to take place, but was in progress, and the speed at which both the militia and the U.S. military were able to galvanize and literally box in those individuals who were part of this rebellion. This is simply an overview of what I've been speaking about. DeLong, once again, is a very interesting individual in the fact that he not only was a slave, but the question had always become if he was a slave driver, as the term is often used. At what point did he change and what changed him? And historians aren't quite sure of why he went from being a very trusted individual to an individual who says, I want my freedom. Did he live better than most slaves? Yes, he did. Could he have continued being in that position? Yes, he could have. What precipitated him to want to make a change such that he would create a free state is left up still to controversy. Some say that he was influenced by what he heard, which had taken place in Haiti. Others maintained that it's the pamphlets which he was reading, which were later found in the slave cabins. Others believe that he simply grew tired of watching the brutality which not only he was carrying out, but the fact that he was watching many people die. There had been a small plague in the area, smallpox, lots of individuals died, and this had a tremendous impact on his continuing to denigrate his, for all practical purposes, his countrymen. That makes him a very interesting character, that he makes this crucial decision to move from being part of the slave system to being part of individuals who want freedom. The rebellion, once again, is not talked about very much. There were other rebellions. In fact, there was a larger rebellion which takes place probably some 40 years later with the Seminoles. But this was very unique, and as I said, because of the language, because of the slaves coming from various parts of the world, because of the individuals who were marooned, all of these people at some point begin to see each other with a common cause. And the creation most certainly of a language whereby they could exchange ideas and plan a rebellion that no one was aware of, and nor its timing, its execution, and its aims, and the military strategy that's going to be used in order to carry this particular revolution out. So that makes it very, very interesting historically. It's very unique in American history. It's very unique in world history. It's not in most history books. Hopefully that it will eventually begin to show up, but it's not. And during this particular time, as we're watching change, these are individuals who definitely wanted change. They did not by any means feel that they could not achieve their goals. They felt they could achieve their goals. So they're very optimistic, even though they realized in some cases they may have been overwhelmed by military force. They decided to launch their rebellion irregardless. I think it's at the point because we don't have a lot of time, that there should be some questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Knight. I appreciate you taking your time to speak to us about the rebellion. Something personally that I really enjoy about your work is your ability to speak on and share these extremely important stories that don't always show up in history books. I know between you and I conversations, there's lots of information here in the Revolt that people didn't know. And I'm really glad you had the opportunity to share some of this to get the conversation started. And hopefully someday, it will start popping up and be a known thing, because these things are extremely important to kind of how the world developed Haiti, the United States, France, and the French. So thank you. Right now, I do want to introduce our museum educator, Ben Henderson. He will be helping us with the Q&A. So Ben, go ahead, introduce yourself, and you can take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Henderson. I'm the museum educator for the museum. So I'm going to be, I'm going to be answering as many questions as possible. So, I'm going to start with looking at the chat, and we got one that just popped up. Can you recommend any further books for further study? Dr. Knight.
And that is further study about this particular rebellion?
Yes, I think that's what I think that's what the person meant.
Okay. There is a book on that's been written about the 1911 Slave Revolt, but mostly you're going to find them in scholarly papers. In fact, you can type in, if you really want just a quick synopsis, you can type in 1911 Revolt and Louisiana, and you're going to get a lot of hits because now it's become very popular. So if you don't want to read a book, and there is a book that is out in detail about this particular revolt. In fact, there is a group in New Orleans that reenacts this rebellion literally every single year. So if you go to YouTube and you type in 1811 Revolt, they'll actually show you actors who wear the clothing of the period, the weapons that were used during the period, and they actually do walk the 26 miles from the first plantation to New Orleans, and they do so every single year. So once again, you got papers, you have a single book, you have small synopses, which are on, whether you go to Yahoo or Google or Bing, you can find that. And you can look at YouTube, which actually shows you the individuals who dress up in March every year.
Well, okay, actually we have a question already. From my understanding, Coachmen played a vital role in the preparation of the slave revolt in Haiti. Was there a similar path that followed in 1811?
When you say Coachmen, would you define that term?
What was the impact of religion? Also, what was the impact of religion in the 1811 revolt? Was it similar to Bois Hyman? Okay, well, go right ahead, Dr. Cranston.
No, yeah, I thought you were going to answer that one. That's that. Or okay.
Well, I can answer some of that stuff, but
okay.
But let's go. Well,
okay.
Well, I don't really know much about the role of Coachmen in the 1811 slave revolt. That would be something that Dr. Cranston would mention. But Coachmen definitely played a vital role in the preparation for the 1791 slave revolt. For example, guys like Dessalines was a coachman. He knew a lot of people who would have helped spread that sort of information. It was really those kind of slaves that were able to be allowed to move around and move to place were very important for the slave revolt because they were the guys who would help spread information. They were the guys who would help spread news. They were the guys who would tell other slaves on plantations about this thing called the Declaration of Rights of Man. They were the guys who would have found people to recruit. They would have been the guys who would have been able to spot who could lead this sort of revolt, who can be the guys who can rally sort of people, who would be the guys who would be able to translate material to, say, a group of slaves who just got off the boat and all that stuff. They were the guys who would try to find, say, someone who could speak Congolese, someone who could speak Haitian Creole, someone who could speak English and all that stuff. They're the guys who facilitate these sort of interactions between different groups of slaves on plantations. So they were very important for anything to get on the ground moving. Now, I don't really know about the role they played in, like, say, the 1811 slave revolt. Could you provide a little more about that, Dr. Cranston?
From what I can gather from having just done some preliminary research, there were other individuals like DeLong, Charles DeLong, who were able to move around primarily because of the fact that the French used their main crop was sugar. So after the sugar cane is harvested, they had time. And they didn't have the type of slave patrols which will exist in the United States later on. these individuals did go down to, as you had pointed out, they did go down to the docks. They were the individuals who did bring people to certain plantations after they had been purchased or parceled out from plantation to plantation. So yes, they were the individuals who could collectively speak among one another, as well as the fact that they were able to speak to those individuals who were going to be enslaved by the French. So they played that vital role of knowing who was where, when, and at what plantation, and how many were on those plantations. So they had a great deal of knowledge.
Okay. All right. So if you want to read more about roles of how slaves were able to pretty much interact with each other and communicate with each other long distances, I would recommend a book called Common Wind by Julius Scott. He kind of does this research on that stuff. He was the kind of guy who researched how slaves were able to communicate over long distances, over across long way trade lanes and all that stuff. Okay, so we got quite a few questions coming in. Did slaves inform slave owners of the pending revolt for their safety or under threat, duress?
You could have both. You had individuals who, for their own safety or duress, let those individuals who were their masters know that this rebellion was going to take place. You had other individuals who were not sympathetic to a rebellion because they feared the repercussion. So it's all of those. To make a long story, so it's all of those. There's individuals who just simply feared the repercussions without question, and those who felt that a rebellion was not in their best interest. In essence, they associated more with the slave class, I'm sorry, with the individuals who held the slave in the slave class than they did with the slave class itself. And now it's true throughout, and that's true in any and every revolt. You always have those individuals who hold more with the colonializer than with the colonialized. That's a very common theme.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Sorry, I'm just having to.
It's okay.
All right. So, we have a question about religion. Okay. Did voodoo or say West African religions play a role in the planning of the 1811 slave revolt, like at Boys Cayman?
That's a good question, because they don't talk very much about religion. We know that people who were coming to the United States had particularly the new individuals or individuals who were there were converted to Catholicism. So you have the Spanish who convert the slaves to Catholicism, as is seen by the Spanish. And of course you have the French who are going to try to convert the people under their rule to Catholicism. So you have both Spanish and French Catholicism that's there. How much the role of voodoo played in that I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the Spanish slaves who had been there for a while associated with voodoo, as some of the individuals who had been in Haiti did. So
okay, I'm gonna add my few cents on religion.
Sure,
and
please.
Well, we barely even know about Boy Cayman ourselves when it comes to Haitian history. The only reason why we know that is because we had some Haitian historian in the 1830s who was able to go around, travel the country and all that stuff, find survivors from the Haitian Revolution and discuss what happened there and all this stuff. And in the case of the 1811 slave revolt, we don't have survivors. They were largely all killed off. So we know less about the role of religion in that case and all that stuff. As for Boys Cayman, it was a very religiously mixed ritual and all that stuff. In fact, it might have taken a course over a few days instead of say one single night, because you had all sorts of different religious groups. You had Christians, you had people who practiced West African religions, you had Muslims and all that stuff. So Coachmen, the leader of the 1791 slave revolt initially, had to kind of do multiple different rituals and multiple different ceremonies in order to convey and meaning and appeal to all these different groups at the same time. So yeah, a lot of these rituals. So if there was a sort of ritual involved in the 1811 slave revolt, it would have probably been more complicated than just, say, sacrificing a pig and saying, oh, this appeals to everyone and all that stuff. Right. You have to appeal to multiple cultural and linguistic groups and all that stuff.
If I can add one other, that's the role of the Americans after the rebellion was crushed. They destroyed all evidence in terms of individuals who were either writing papers about it. Anyone who knew anything about that rebellion was silenced. And so to a great degree, we don't know all the things that took place in that rebellion because so much was destroyed by the Americans. They were so fearful that this rebellion would leak out and become, want to be duplicated by slaves that was being held by the Americans themselves, that they did everything that they could to destroy it, which is why we don't hear a lot about it, only until relatively recent. They destroyed everything, literally. Anyone that was going to talk, they were executed. And so you didn't talk. And so it became silent once the papers are destroyed, because there were individuals who did write about it. And they're writing about it because not only were they historians, but simply because they wrote about it for perhaps the local newspapers. They were all destroyed.
Yeah. Actually, that leads kind of one of my own personal questions about the slave revolt. Like, why do we talk about less about Desalon than, say, Nat Turner and all that stuff? Why do we know more about Nat Turner and all that stuff as opposed to Desalon and his co-conspirators?
I think probably because you get a switch. So when you get the French territory being turned over to the Americans with the Louisiana Purchase, that's all taken by the Americans. So the Americans actually can control the narrative, and they controlled that narrative so that you can sequester and destroy what had taken place in Louisiana. Turner himself, there's lots of people who write about him, and that's picking up, taken by local newspapers. They want people to know that there had been this particular slave who had rebelled against his slave master. Of course, his death is gruesome as that of DeLong, just as gruesome, but it was in their interest to let people know that this rebellion had taken place, but more importantly, that it had been crushed. To let people know about the situation which had taken place in Louisiana, the French are not exactly the friends of the Americans and were highly disliked. In fact, there's the French and English War. So although the French did help the Americans during that particular war, once that is over, the Americans have no interest in the French whatsoever. Okay. So after 1812 war, as far as they're concerned, there's no reason to say there were 300 to 500 slaves who rebelled and that what they want is a free state. That's sedition. So you're not going to do that. You're not going to talk about, you can talk about an individual who says, hey, I'm rebelling. Okay, there have been slave revolts. That's one thing. But when you have an clear ideology, and that ideology is about the rights of man, that the whole concept of nation was going to be created by these individuals, now you become not only that existential threat, you become a threat to the whole society in and of itself. And you have principles that you're fighting for, that people clearly understood. DeLong clearly understands these principles of freedom. You don't want those shared. You don't want that type of information out there. It's one thing to have a rebellion. It's very different to talk about a state.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so we got a question from Professor Curtis Keynes. His question is about how does the slave revolt connects to what happened to the Amstat? And should there be a mandate to have it taught in American schools?
If you don't mind my interjecting, that's not necessarily what I asked. I was asking if you were familiar with the Amstat Commission here in the state of Illinois, which passed the state legislature in 2005. And the reason why, I asked the question there, I kind of answered it too. But the thing is that it's not being enforced in a way that you see it being administered on the south and west sides of the city, predominantly African-American schools, not all of them, but it's not happening widespread, particularly in non-African-American communities. So I was wondering, with this important information that you're delivering, Dr. Wright, as well as in the backdrop of 1619 last year, where the struggle not only in terms of getting this information out and teaching young people, there's still a strong force to block it. For example, Senator Cotton out of Arkansas about 3 weeks ago, some of you may be familiar, absolutely had the audacity to say that slavery was a necessary evil.
Yes.
As he was passing a law to basically keep 1619 out. So, just ask everyone else, and thank you for the invite, Professor Hernandez. Are you familiar with the Amstat Commission here in Illinois? And if so, have you, I'll just let you ask the question. If you're familiar with it.
Okay, Dr. Knight, do you want to take the lead on this one?
Okay, so are you speaking to me about the commission? Because I thought you had directed it towards someone else, but
it was you actually, but I mean anyone can jump in.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I think it's important that yes, all that history should go into the without question curriculums that's been studied from kindergarten onward. It's not just something that should be held by a few so-called elites who grace our universities, and most of them don't know about it. And it's very clear why you don't want them to know about it. So are you going to teach that at Notre Dame? No. Are you going to teach that at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton? No. Are you going to have individuals who are interested in it? Yes, but it stays only in those particular departments. So you have a Department of Caribbean Studies. So yeah, you're going to have it there. You may have a Department of African American Studies. It may be taught there. But in both cases, individuals may not know about these particular rebellions because it was not in the interest of their professors to know, and it wasn't in the interest of the professors who taught them to know. So in essence, what you do is if you don't want something taught, you don't introduce it.
Yeah.
And if you don't
we're in a day of a reckoning right now, I think, in terms of the reckoning, if you will, not only just in terms of Confederate icons coming down, this and the other, but this information here, along with 1619, it's hard for them to try to put it back in the bottle.
Yeah, I would say yes. I would say you're absolutely right. There's some things you can't put back into the bottle. But much like we're meeting here, how many people know about this rebellion? Well, very few. And how many are going to study about it because they don't know it exists? Well, very few, unless we decide to put together some type of curriculum that could be used by the school board, not only in Illinois, but across the United States. That could be infused when one talks about American history, not just African American history or African history, but American history, because this shapes American history. They put in extremely harsh penalties for anyone wanting to, quote unquote, gain their freedom. To be able to read, to be able to write. I mean, those things became very important. And that's why the concept of a nation, which is what Bennett was discussing, becomes so important. If you don't want a nation to be created, you don't educate the population. And you most certainly don't allow them to read the type of information such that they can begin to talk about the rights of men. And how was the French Revolution, how does what comes out of that revolution in terms of ideology transferred to individuals who are enslaved? And how do they take that information and relate that to their own lives such that they can move forward? And then how does that translate to what will become the United States, and how those individuals take that information and it becomes multinational because you've got people, coming from Angola, coming from Congo who are arriving. You've got individuals who have been under Spanish domination, under French domination. And individuals who were Maroons who had run away and they had their own societies out in the bayou. You've got all these different people. You don't want that information shared, so what do? You destroy it.
Right.
So your reckoning, as you discussed, will come when those individuals of us who know about this can create the curriculums which can be introduced into the core curriculum of students, regardless of their race. They need to know about it because it is American history. It's what shapes this country to what it is today. So yes, your reckoning is, you read it, you discuss it, you see the films about it, and you say, wow, that's, this is what this is all about. It's about these individuals who, regardless of how outnumbered they may have been, felt that they could be free people, and more importantly, that they could set up a state, and they call it a free black state, by former slaves that was similar to the one of the revolution which had taken place in Haiti. That is a tremendous change.
Absolutely.
To talk about, I have a political agenda. I have a military agenda that's going to get us to that political agenda, and that political agenda is that all men are created equal, and that it is the nation state that we hold our allegiance to. Imagine a state within a state. Within the United States is still forming by that time. So imagine, and then you got your indigenous population that's out there. And how is that going to impact those individuals? Because you do get another rebellion with the Seminole Indian population, as the slaves are coming through, and the 3 Seminole Wars, which are going to take place. Imagine if those individuals had that information of, we're not going to leave, okay, we're going to protect the individuals who are here. But what we really want is a free nation of indigenous and African population within the United States. Imagine that's radical. So yeah, you had to suppress and destroy all knowledge of that, because to have that type of information spread would have been detrimental not only to the slave population, the individuals who held the slaves, but it would have been detrimental when we look at that second very large rebellion with the Seminoles themselves. So to answer your question, yes, it needs to be in the core curriculum.
Gotcha, yeah.
All right. Okay, so we're kind of out of questions in the chat. So so if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask out loud.
Well, I do see a few more in here, Dr. Knight, that I'd like to ask you. So we have one from Roberta, I believe, and it reads, excuse my ignorance, in 1811, are the Americans predominantly of British heritage or other Europeans?
Oh, I already answered that question privately to her. America was already a very diverse country at that point. When you just look at white people in general, black people were not yet considered. They refused to acknowledge any sort of diversity among them. But there was already, you had, for example, Dutch people who were descended of the Dutch who originally settled in New York. You had the Scots-Irish. You had a lot of Germans as well. So you already had this pretty much idea of America being an immigration nation that was already existing. So you already had that diversity among white people, but you also, of course, had slaves who had their own ancestry and all that stuff. And then, of course, you had indigenous people who weren't killed off, who integrated into white society and all that stuff. So the idea of a Anglo-United States did not really ever exist in the beginning. So, all right.
I see another one from Joe Schmidt. It says, question on what Dr. Knight just said. What was the indigenous Taino population of Haiti during the Haitian Revolution?
I can answer that question. They were they were all gone.
Yes, you're right.
They were all killed pretty much by Spanish by the 17th century. So
they were gone. So if you talk about the Caribbean Indians who were in Cuba, all the Indian population from the area that's Haiti all the way down to Venezuela, all those islands, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, all that Indian population had gone into extinction by that time. They'd all been killed off, either by war, being worked to death. And in fact, there's a couple of videos I would use in class that shows just how malicious and just how destructive the Europeans who were coming into those societies were, driving them into mines where they worked underground, taking gold out of their teeth. I mean, it was, just hacking off limbs. I mean, it was horrific. And then, of course, there was what was called ecocide. They had introduced the pig, and because of the type of teeth that they have, they pull out the roots of the plants. It was the first time that that had ever existed. So people couldn't eat. You couldn't plant something because they're going to eat it. You had the introduction of the Norway rat that carried lots of disease. The people who were arriving themselves carried disease, the common cold. To make a long story short, they didn't have a chance. But the brutality, the sheer brutality against men and women of Indian heritage in the Caribbean, there literally was nothing like it. I mean, it's Columbus who comes back in that second voyage for conquest. And when he comes back on that second voyage, he comes back with ships of men in armor with cannons for the conquest. And he kills a heck of a lot of people. There was an individual who did keep a diary. He was a Catholic monk. Like Augustine, he wrote about the horror which he saw. And his book still exists. So in detail, he wrote it in detail about all the things that were taking place in the area once Columbus arrives back in Hispaniola.
Yeah.
Would you please spell the last name of that Catholic monk you just referred to, please?
Okay, now you asked me to do something that I don't have my screen up to spell his name correctly. I'm trying to think of a way to segment it. I think a good way to be able to spell it is if you went in and wrote in, what was the name of the Catholic priest who arrived in the New World with Columbus, and his name will come up.
I already got the name up.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
It's right here. It's Bartholomew Lacasis.
Yes.
Yeah, about the genocide of the indigenous population. The main impetus to bring slaves to the New World in such massive numbers was because by the 16th century was that the native population could no longer provide the labor that was required to make these colonies profitable. You needed those slaves in order to make up for the loss of that population. You needed a population that could work in the tropics, was not vulnerable to tropical disease, and just could not die in as large numbers as fast as the indigenous population did once exposure to European diseases happened. So the African population was in a convenient location because it was part of that triangular network, and thus it was very easy for European ships to go from Africa and then go to the New World in order to resupply these colonies with labor. The reason why the Caribbean is generally has a lot of people of African descent is because these colonies particularly needed all that labor, and because the native population was largely gone by the 16th century. So,
yeah. If I can add two things. One thing that the priest did was he did a lot of drawings. So he not only wrote about, but he actually drew depictions of the genocide. And in fact, online, you have his drawings. So the Spanish used war dogs, and then I think there were only a military which did. And these were dogs which as pups were not given food, but they ate human corpse. So they got a taste for blood. So when by the time you get to the fighting between the Muslims and Christians, and particularly in Spain, in Cordoba, you have these war dogs, and they were sent out, they would attack, and they would eviscerate anyone that they came in contact with. So in essence, they're biting you in the gut and they're pulling your guts out. And so when they come to the Americas, they bring these war dogs with them. And the native population had never seen anything like it. You cannot outrun a dog. And these dogs literally eviscerated large numbers of people, men, women, children. It didn't matter. I mean, a dog doesn't see differences in terms of age. Also, just the wholesale rape of the women population that was there. And what you get from this is the concept of other. You really get it had already existed in Europe, but you get a very clear delineation of the other once they go into the Caribbean. And that's because of dress, the type of codes which existed in terms of what makes one person different than the next. Dress. In Europe, under the law, a woman had to have her hair covered, and most certainly she had to have a long dress. If she didn't wear that, she was considered to be a quote unquote a wayward woman, and any man had a right to her body. So you arrive now in the Caribbean, where women don't wear hair coverings, and where women were in quote unquote scantily clad. Was that considered to be sexual? No, it was not. You're arriving in the Caribbean where, excuse me, if we look at the issue biologically, the concept of why women were witches, which was coming from the Catholic bull at that time or a little bit before, maintained that women were witches, and they were witches because of their menstrual cycle. They could not understand why a woman could bleed and survive. They knew very clearly if a man was cut, he would either get an infection or he would heal. Women didn't. And therefore the church maintained that women were witches. So once they arrive in the New World and they're coming into women who are having their menses, these women are witches. And you're subject in Europe to banishment. In the New World, they were subject to death. They're also coming with the issues of race and class, because there was class in Europe. And that didn't exist in the New World. And most certainly the issue in terms of race. So these individuals are seen as inferior to those individuals who they're coming in contact with based on their skin. So that whole concept of the fact that you don't like your friend and you want to do harm to them, you place a rose on their bed. The fact that you could be black-hearted meant that you were someone who I couldn't trust in a business transaction. That concept of blackness is evil. Well, that's starting during the medieval period, and it's used, but once they arrive in the New World, it's expanded upon, and the concept of other is solidified. As we talk about, if we're talking about the slave trade, 5% of the slaves come to the United States. 95% of all those slaves go to the Americas. So when we talk about slavery, and at some point, talk about comparative slave systems, because only 5% come to Estados Unidos. Everybody else go to the Americas, which is why when you go to places like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, everybody looks African, because that's their descendants. And that was true all of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was almost 100% African, with a few Spanish who were there. That was also true of Cuba. Cuba was almost 100% slave, with the exception of the whites who dominated. So that's also going to be true in Mexico. So we're talking Mesoamerica. The slave population, the people there were made up of the indigenous population, and the slaves are going to be brought into the area, and the Spanish are going to take the area. That's true for Venezuela, Honduras, Honduras, Costa Rica, all across the Americas, Ecuador, it was the same thing.
All right, we have time for a few more questions. Anyone who wants to jump in, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them out loud.
I just had kind of a funny comment. Since
Sorry, who's talking?
Oh, this is Sonia Chomat.
Oh.
Okay. I just had a funny comment that there have been people who are questioning the ancestry of the current VP candidate for the Democrats simply because her father's Jamaican. They're like, well, how can she be considered African American? Her father was Jamaican. So I just had to laugh because it's like people who have no historical perspective at all and have no idea of how people with darker skin arrived on all those islands. They have no sense of anything.
Yeah, and in fact, when we talk about this issue of Black, my favorite hero was Sidney Poitier. So I'm growing up, and we didn't have Denzel Washington, but we did have Sidney Poitier.
Yeah.
And Sidney was the guy. I mean, you know, the actor, right? But he wasn't from the United States. He was from the Caribbean. And so a lot of the leaders of, without question, my heart goes out for John Lewis. But his successor, Stokely Carmichael, who's had a snake,
Yes.
he comes from the Caribbean.
Caribbeans,
Yeah.
right. Mhm.
Right, he comes from the Caribbean. And he was fiery. And that's going to be true for many, 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 many people, including the former Secretary of State, Colin Powell. His family was also immigrants. So when people are talking about the individuals who had been assassinated by the police, Diablo was Somali, and he was shot 41 times. They talk a lot about, it's Wycliffe that really brings him on the map in one of his songs. It was not Bruce Springsteen. So Bruce Springsteen, I'm looking at television and it says, he was the first to talk about Diablo. And I'm going like, I think it was Wycliffe, because I remember listening to it on one of his albums, because one of my kids introduced me to Wycliffe. And so even within the movement, there's misinformation. So if you can type in Wycliffe and you can type in Diablo on YouTube, and he's talking about it in his song, 41 shots.
Yes.
And
Dr. Wright, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, just yes, sir. With the question in terms, hopefully our new VP, Senator Harris, what they're engaged in simply really is othering. They're trying to other her.
Absolutely.
In a way, and of course, that one drop of black blood rule, African blood rule, is always a process they use in terms of. But I think hopefully, it will not take too much traction, whereby there will be the headline news, etc. And I was really, really happy to see that they came out immediately last week saying that this is really just another form of racism in context to questioning whether or not she's an American citizen. But it's
I like what Trevor Noah said. Trevor Noah says, people are saying, well, she's not black or not black enough. I like Trevor Noah, who says the first time she makes either one or two mistakes, she surely is going to be black. So, it's like, so she doesn't have to wait. People don't have to wait long to discover what she's going to be, because the first time she makes anything that's going to be what's going to be, as far as certain people are going to be mistake, she's going to be black. So there will be no question there.
Yeah, that she doesn't question that I am. She identifies as a black woman, But I was thinking if she would say I'm an Indian woman, people have a problem with that, But I just hope again, just that we can really get the vote out, because we got to get.
I agree with you 100. I agree with you 100%.
Absolutely.
100%.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to speak out loud.
I just wanted to say thank you. Really enlightening, really interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right.
I'm glad everyone who arrived today to listen to the lecture participated, and I hope that some new information was shared. And my takeaway for me is that a curriculum definitely should this revolt should be part of that, as well as many others, because there's so much that people don't know, and they don't know it not because they don't want to know it, but because it's not freely, not that it's not freely accessible, it's that no one is talking about it. And no one has put together something that is comprehensive such that we can begin to teach children about these very important changes which will take place in what we call the United States.
All right.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Knight, so much for your amazing lecture and conversation today. Ben, thank you for moderating the Q&A. And for everyone who was able to join us today, thank you so much for being here. These conversations are important, and I'm hoping that we can take everything that we learned today, the insightful conversations and thoughts that were shared, and bring it into our own communities to really start doing the work and making sure that these untold stories are really brought into light, because like we've said, they really are the shape and how the structure of how kind of the world is right now. So what I'm gonna do is in the chat, I am sending right now just a quick 5 question survey. If anyone and everyone has the time to fill that out, that'd be fantastic, just to get a little feedback about your experience today. But again, on behalf of HAMOC, we appreciate your support. Thank you for spending an hour and a half of your Saturday afternoon. Please contact the museum if there's anything we can help you with, any clarification or anything regarding education or this lecture itself. We'll be very, very, very happy to help you all in your respective organizations and any research that you're doing. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr.
All right,
Knight.
thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone enjoy the rest of your day, okay?
All right, thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Thank you. Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.